The wind cut across the ridge like a blade, carrying dust and the faint smell of diesel from the generators below. Lieutenant Vera Callahan pressed her eye against the spotting scope, scanning the valley floor 3,000 meters out. Nothing moved except the heat shimmer rising off the rocks. She made another notation in her logbook, recording wind speed, temperature differential, and barometric pressure. The numbers told a story most people never bothered to read. Behind her, the operations tent buzzed with frustrated voices. She could hear Colonel Hayes, his tone sharp with the kind of pressure that came from above, from people who wore stars and expected results. The mission clock had been running for 17 days. 17 days of watching, waiting, and coming up empty. Vera lowered the scope and stretched her neck, feeling the tension that had become permanent in her shoulders. She had been assigned to observation and equipment management, which meant she spent her days logging environmental data and maintaining gear, while the primary sniper team, Rodriguez and Bennett, handled what they called the real work. They were good men, skilled operators with solid records. They also had a habit of dismissing her input with polite nods that meant nothing. She returned to the scope, methodically working through her sector scan. The target, a high-value individual with the designation Scorpion, had been operating in this region for 3 years. Intelligence placed him somewhere in the network of villages and compounds scattered across the valley, but pinpointing his location had proven impossible. He moved like smoke, appearing and vanishing without pattern or warning. Except Vera had started to see something. Small things. Inconsistencies in the timing of vehicle movements. Patterns in the way certain compounds went dark or lit up. She had filled 2 notebooks with observations that everyone else dismissed as coincidence or irrelevant detail. Before we dive into this operation, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed extraordinary skill being overlooked in your community. Rodriguez emerged from the operations tent, his face tight with irritation. He walked over to where she sat, squinting against the afternoon sun. Bennett followed a few steps behind, carrying his rifle case with the careful attention of someone who treated their weapon better than most people treated family. Rodriguez said they had another dry hole. Command had been certain Scorpion would be at the northern compound, and they had spent 6 hours in position, watching a building where nothing happened. Now Hayes was on the satellite phone, getting his 4th dressing down this week, from people who thought war could be managed like a spreadsheet. Vera kept her eye on the scope. She asked if they had checked the timing against the power grid fluctuations. Rodriguez looked at her like she had suggested consulting a fortune teller. Bennett snorted, adjusting the rifle case on his shoulder. Bennett said power grids and target location had nothing to do with each other. These people barely had electricity half the time anyway. Vera did not argue. She had learned that lesson in her first week. Instead, she simply pointed out that in her logs, every confirmed sighting of suspected Scorpion associates had occurred within 2 hours of scheduled power outages in the western sector. Rodriguez frowned, not quite dismissing it, but not quite accepting it either. He said they were working off solid intelligence, signals intercepts, and informant reports. Vera's environmental data was useful for shop planning, but they needed hard intelligence for target acquisition. She understood his position. She was 26 years old, looked younger, and had been assigned to support roles since arriving at the forward operating base. Her personnel file showed her sniper qualification scores, but files did not matter as much as reputation, and she had not been given opportunities to build one. Bennett said they needed to focus on the next target window. Intelligence suggested Scorpion would be moving supplies through the southern route tomorrow morning. Hayes wanted them in position before dawn. Vera made another notation in her log. The southern route. She had data on that area, wind patterns that shifted violently around the narrow canyon, making long-range shots nearly impossible during morning hours. The thermals created unpredictable updrafts that could push a bullet off course by meters of distance. She mentioned the wind data. Rodriguez nodded, said they would adjust for it. Bennett was already walking back toward the tent, done with the conversation. Rodriguez lingered for a moment, his expression caught between courtesy and impatience. He told her to keep logging the environmental data. It was valuable work, even if it was not as exciting as pulling the trigger. Then he followed Bennett, leaving Vera alone on the ridge with her scope and her notebooks full of patterns no one wanted to see. She returned to her scan, patient and methodical. Her father had taught her that observation was not about looking, it was about seeing. Master Sergeant Theodore Callahan had been a Marine Corps sniper instructor, a man who could read wind like poetry and calculate bullet drop in his head faster than most people could work a calculator. He had died when she was 19, taking his reputation with him, leaving her to build her own. The problem was that no one wanted to let her build it. They saw her age, her gender, her quiet demeanor, and they made decisions about what she could and could not do. So she kept her logs, recorded her data, and waited for the moment when the numbers would matter more than assumptions. The sun dropped lower, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow. Vera watched a small convoy move along the eastern road, 3 vehicles traveling in formation. She noted their speed, direction, and the time. In her notebook, she cross-referenced it with previous movements. Another piece of the puzzle. Somewhere in this valley, Scorpion was planning his next move. And somewhere in her data, Vera knew she had already found him. She just needed someone to listen. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavier than usual, thick with moisture that had rolled in overnight. Vera stood outside the operations tent, watching Rodriguez and Bennett prepare for the Southern Route operation. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times, checking equipment, reviewing range cards, speaking in the shorthand that came from years of working together. Colonel Hayes emerged from the tent, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of a tactical flashlight. He looked older than his 52 years, worn down by the weight of a mission that refused to resolve. He approached the sniper team, reviewed the plan one final time, then sent them off with orders to maintain radio silence unless they had eyes on target. Vera waited until they disappeared into the darkness before approaching Hayes. She carried her notebook, the pages marked with color tabs and cross-referenced observations. Hayes glanced at her, his expression somewhere between patience and exhaustion. She said she needed to show him something. Hayes sighed but gestured for her to continue. Vera opened the notebook to a page covered in carefully plotted timelines and movement patterns. She explained that every confirmed Scorpion associate movement over the past 17 days corresponded with specific infrastructure events, power outages, water delivery schedules, and fuel truck arrivals. Hayes studied the data, his frown deepening. He asked what she was suggesting. Vera pointed to the timeline, showing how the pattern predicted that Scorpion would not be anywhere near the Southern Route this morning. Instead, based on a scheduled generator maintenance in the western sector, he would most likely be at a compound they had not yet surveilled, a location nearly 4 kilometers from the nearest established observation point. The colonel closed the notebook and handed it back to her. He said intelligence did not work on generator maintenance schedules. They had signals intercepts placing Scorpion on the Southern Route, and that was where the assets would be positioned. Vera could continue her environmental logging, but operational decisions were based on actionable intelligence, not theoretical patterns. She understood dismissal when she heard it, but something made her push back. She asked what would happen if Rodriguez and Bennett spent another day in position with no target acquisition. How much longer before command pulled the plug on the entire operation? Hayes looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but recognition of an uncomfortable truth. He said 3 more dry holes, and they would be recalled. The mission would be handed to a different unit, and his command would carry the weight of failure. Then he walked back into the tent, leaving her standing in the darkness with her unread data. The morning dragged past with excruciating slowness. Vera maintained her observation post, scanning sectors and recording environmental conditions. The wind had picked up, gusting unpredictably through the canyon system exactly as her data had predicted. At the Southern Route, Rodriguez and Bennett would be fighting those thermals, trying to maintain sight lines through air that moved like water. By noon, the radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice, flat and professional, reporting no target acquisition. Bennett added that the wind conditions were making sustained observation nearly impossible. They would maintain position through the target window, but confidence was low. Vera set down her scope and pulled out her notebook. The Western Sector compound sat at the edge of her observation range, barely visible as a cluster of buildings against the hillside. She had been tracking it peripherally, noting vehicle movements and activity patterns. According to her calculations, if Scorpion followed the pattern she had identified, he would appear there within the next 3 hours. She adjusted her position, bringing the Western compound into primary focus. The distance was extreme, well beyond standard observation range, but her optics were good and the afternoon light was favorable. She settled into watch, knowing that if she was wrong, it was just another day of being ignored. But if she was right, if she could provide confirmation of her pattern analysis, maybe someone would finally listen. 2 hours passed. Vera remained motionless, her eye pressed to the scope, watching for movement. Her back ached and her legs had gone numb from maintaining position. But she had learned patience from her father. He used to say that sniping was not about shooting, it was about being willing to wait longer than everyone else. Then she saw it. A vehicle convoy, 3 trucks moving along the access road to the Western compound. They moved slowly, carefully, with the kind of caution that suggested valuable cargo or important passengers. Vera increased magnification, fighting the slight atmospheric distortion at this range. The vehicles stopped to the compound entrance. Men emerged, 5 of them, wearing civilian clothes but moving with military precision. They formed a protective detail around the middle vehicle as someone stepped out. The distance was too great for facial identification, but the body language was unmistakable. This was someone important, someone the others deferred to. Vera grabbed the radio, then hesitated. If she called it in and was wrong, it would cement her reputation as someone who wasted operational resources on hunches. But if she was right and said nothing, she would be letting the target slip away again. She keyed the radio and called for Colonel Hayes. His response came immediately, sharp and impatient. She reported possible target activity at the Western Sector compound. Multiple military-age males with a high-value individual based on security posture and movement patterns. Hayes asked for confirmation. She said visual identification was impossible at this range, but the activity matched the pattern she had documented. There was a long silence on the radio. Then Hayes said to maintain observation and stand by. Vera returned to her scope, tracking the figures as they moved into the compound. The security detail posted at multiple points, establishing a perimeter. This was not a supply run or casual visit. This was someone who expected threats. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, checking in from the southern route. Still nothing. Hayes ordered them to pack up and return to base. Then he told Vera to keep eyes on the Western compound and document everything she saw. She watched for another hour as the compound came alive with activity. More vehicles arrived. The security detail rotated positions. Someone important was definitely inside those walls. And if Vera's pattern analysis was correct, it was the man they had been hunting for 17 days. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, and Vera knew they were running out of time. Once darkness fell, any chance of confirmation would vanish with the light. She maintained her vigil, documenting every movement, every detail, building a case that could not be ignored. Somewhere in that compound was the answer to the question that had consumed this entire operation. And for the first time since arriving at this desolate ridge, Vera Callahan felt the weight of certainty that came from numbers that did not lie. Rodriguez and Bennett returned to base just as the sun touched the horizon, their faces showing the frustration of another wasted day. They dropped their gear with barely controlled aggression, the kind that came from professionals who knew they were failing but could not identify why. Vera remained at her observation post, her eyes still locked on the Western compound, watching as lights began to flicker on inside the buildings. Colonel Hayes climbed the ridge to her position, moving with the deliberate pace of someone carrying too much weight on too little sleep. He crouched beside her, and she shifted to give him access to the spotting scope. He studied the compound for several minutes, his breathing steady and controlled despite the climb. Hayes asked what she saw. Vera walked him through the activity she had documented over the past 3 hours. 7 vehicles total, security rotation every 45 minutes, communications equipment visible on the roof, and most significantly, a command-level security posture that indicated someone of substantial importance was inside. She had counted at least 15 armed personnel, far more than a typical compound in this region would maintain. Hayes lowered the scope and looked at her. He said intelligence had no intercepts placing anyone significant at this location. Their entire operational focus had been built around signals intelligence that pointed to the southern route. Vera said signals intelligence could be manipulated, but infrastructure patterns were harder to fake. Scorpion had stayed ahead of them for 3 years by being unpredictable, but everyone had patterns if you watched long enough. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, staring at the compound as darkness settled over the valley. Then he asked about range to target. Vera checked her calculations. For 1,200 meters, nearly 2.6 miles. Hayes let out a slow breath. That distance put the compound beyond effective engagement range for any weapon system they had on site. He said even if she was right, even if Scorpion was in that compound right now, they had no way to reach him. By the time they repositioned assets or called in air support, he would be gone. They needed confirmation of identity before committing resources, and at this range, visual confirmation was impossible. Vera said nothing, but her mind was already working through the mathematics. For 1,200 meters was extreme, but not impossible. Her father had made shots at distances that other snipers called fantasy. He had taught her that every impossible shot was just a solvable equation, variables that could be calculated and accounted for if you had the skill and the patience. Hayes stood, his knees popping in the cold air. He told her to maintain observation through the night. If the target was still present at dawn, they would reassess options. He paused before descending the ridge, then added that if her pattern analysis proved correct, he would make sure it was noted in her personnel file. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received since arriving. The night stretched long and cold. Vera rotated between her scope and thermal imaging equipment, tracking heat signatures and movement patterns within the compound. Rodriguez brought her coffee around midnight, settling beside her with the easy silence of someone who understood observation work. He asked if she really thought Scorpion was down there. She said the numbers suggested it. Rodriguez nodded slowly, sipping his coffee. He said he had been doing this work for 12 years, and he had learned to trust his gut. But his gut had been wrong for 17 days straight on this operation, so maybe it was time to trust someone else's numbers. He asked about her background, how she ended up in a support role with sniper scores that were flagged as exceptional in her file. Vera kept her eye on the scope as she explained. Her father had been Theodore Callahan, a name that meant something in Marine sniper circles. She had grown up on ranges, learning to read wind and calculate drops before she learned algebra. But carrying a famous name in the military was complicated. People either expected too much or assumed she was writing a legacy she had not earned. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then he said Theodore Callahan had instructed him at sniper school 8 years ago. The man could read environmental conditions like he had supernatural sight. Rodriguez had never met anyone who understood ballistics at that level. He asked if she had inherited that skill. Vera said her father had taught her that skill was not inherited. It was built through 10,000 hours of practice and absolute commitment to understanding every variable. She had spent those 10,000 hours, logged every one of them, but no one wanted to give her the chance to prove it mattered. Rodriguez finished his coffee and stood. He said tomorrow they would see if her numbers were as good as her father's instincts. Then he headed back down the ridge, leaving her alone with her equipment and the distant glow of the compound lights. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale blue. Vera had remained at her post through the entire night, fighting exhaustion with methodical focus. Her logs now contained detailed documentation of every movement, every vehicle arrival and departure, every rotation of the security detail. The pattern was undeniable. This compound was hosting someone significant, and that someone had arrived exactly when and where her infrastructure analysis had predicted. Colonel Hayes returned with the sunrise, accompanied by Rodriguez and Bennett. They gathered around her observation post, studying the compound through various optics. Bennett confirmed the security posture was consistent with high-value target protection. Rodriguez verified the vehicle types matched known Scorpion Associate Transportation. Hayes reviewed Vera's documentation, page after page of meticulous observation. The colonel lowered her notebook and looked at the three of them. He said command needed confirmation before authorizing any direct action. They could request drone surveillance, but that would take hours to coordinate, and there was no guarantee the target would remain in place. They could attempt to move a ground team closer for positive identification, but the terrain offered limited approach options and high risk of detection. Bennett asked about long-range observation. Could they get optics close enough for facial recognition without compromising position? Rodriguez shook his head. The only positions with adequate sight lines were exposed and would require movement across open ground during daylight. Any competent security detail would spot them. Vera continued scanning the compound, and then she saw it. A figure emerged onto the roof of the main building, accompanied by two security personnel. He moved to the edge, looking out over the valley with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. The morning light caught his face, and even at 4,000 meters, certain details became visible. The posture, the build, the way the security detail positioned themselves. She told Hayes to look at the roof, northern corner. He swung his scope to the location, and she heard his breathing change. Bennett and Rodriguez followed suit, both men tensing as they acquired the target. For a long moment, no one spoke. They were all seeing the same thing, all recognizing what it meant. Hayes said they needed to confirm identification through intelligence channels, cross-reference with known photographs. But they also needed to act fast because this window would not last. He reached for his radio, then hesitated, looking at Vera. He asked if she understood what her pattern analysis had just accomplished. She understood. She had found the target that had eluded an entire operation for 17 days. But finding him and reaching him were different problems, and the second problem was about to become everyone's focus. The operations tent became a hive of controlled chaos. Colonel Hayes had satellite imagery pulled from 3 different timestamps, cross-referencing the figure on the roof with known photographs of Scorpion. The facial structure matched, the height and build aligned, and the security detail configuration was consistent with previous confirmed sightings from 2 years prior. Intelligence analysts on the other end of the satellite link gave it an 85% probability match. Hayes said 85% was not certainty, but it was the best confirmation they had achieved in 17 days. He ordered Rodriguez and Bennett to begin planning for immediate repositioning to establish a viable shooting position. The 2 men spread maps across the table, studying terrain features and approach routes with the intensity of people who knew time was running out. Vera stood at the edge of the tent, listening as they worked through the tactical problem. Rodriguez identified 3 potential positions that would bring them within effective range, but each require between 4 and 6 hours of movement across exposed terrain. Bennett pointed out that the security detail would likely spot them before they could establish position. Even if they moved under darkness, setting up for a daylight shot would require remaining concealed through an entire day with hostile forces actively patrolling the area. Hayes asked about aerial assets. Could they get a drone strike authorized based on 85% confirmation? The intelligence officer on the satellite link said that level of certainty would not clear the threshold for kinetic action in a populated area. They needed 95% or direct action on the ground. Rules of engagement were clear, and command was not willing to risk civilian casualties on a probability. The discussion continued, each option evaluated and discarded. Time-to-target calculations kept coming back to the same problem. By the time they could position assets for effective engagement, Scorpion would be gone. Intelligence suggested he never remained in one location for more than 24 hours, and he had already been at this compound for 18 hours based on Vera's surveillance timeline. Vera studied the maps spread across the table, her mind working through calculations that had nothing to do with approach routes or movement times. She looked at the range cards, the ballistic tables, the environmental data she had been collecting for 17 days. 4,200 meters. The number sat in her head like a challenge, like something her father would have called an interesting problem. Rodriguez slammed his hand on the table in frustration. He said they had the target in sight for the first time in over 2 weeks, and they were going to lose him because they could not get close enough fast enough. Bennett suggested calling in Special Operations Forces, someone with helicopter insertion capability. Hayes said that would take a minimum of 12 hours to coordinate, and they did not have 12 hours. Vera spoke quietly, almost to herself, saying the shot was possible from current position. The tent went silent. All eyes turned to her. Hayes asked her to repeat that. She said the distance was 4,200 meters, approximately 2.6 miles. With proper environmental calculation and equipment modification, the shot was within theoretical capability. Bennett laughed, a short bark of disbelief. He said the longest confirmed sniper kill in history was just over 3,000 meters, and that was under perfect conditions with specialized equipment and extensive preparation. What Vera was suggesting was not just difficult, it was fantasy. Rodriguez was more measured, but equally skeptical. He said even if the physics supported it, the margin for error at that distance will be measured in inches over a bullet flight time of nearly 8 seconds. A single miscalculation of wind, temperature, or elevation would result in a miss by meters. Hayes looked at Vera with an expression she could not quite read. He asked if she was serious. She pulled out her notebook, opening to pages filled with environmental data, ballistic calculations, and trajectory models. She had been running these numbers for the past 6 hours, working through every variable. Wind patterns at the compound were predictable based on 17 days of observation. Temperature gradients were documented. Elevation data was precise. She knew the atmospheric conditions at every 100-meter interval between her position and the target. She explained that standard engagement doctrine considered shots beyond 2,000 meters extremely difficult because of the number of variables. But variables were not obstacles if you had sufficient data. She had more environmental data on this valley than any operation she had studied. Her father had taught her that impossible shots were just equations no one else was willing to solve. Rodriguez walked over and looked at her calculations. His expression shifted from skepticism to something more complicated. He said the math looked sound, but math on paper and bullets in flight were different things. There were factors that could not be calculated: atmospheric anomalies, equipment limitations, human error. At 4,000 meters, the bullet would drop nearly 400 feet. A crosswind of 5 miles per hour would push the round off course by over 6 feet. Vera said she had calculated a 12-foot drop compensation and accounted for the prevailing wind pattern that shifted predictably through the canyon system every morning. She had also factored in the Coriolis effect, the Earth's rotation impacting long-range trajectory. Every variable that could be measured had been measured. What remained was execution. Bennett said even if she made the shot, even if everything went perfectly, they would only get one chance. The sound alone would alert the entire compound. The security detail would evacuate the target immediately. Miss, and Scorpion would disappear, probably forever. He asked if she understood what she was proposing to stake on a single trigger pull. She understood. She was proposing to stake the entire mission, 18 days of operational effort, and her career on her ability to execute a shot that most snipers would call impossible. Hayes studied her for a long moment, then looked at Rodriguez. He asked for an honest assessment. Rodriguez was quiet, weighing his words carefully. Rodriguez said Vera's father could have made the shot. Theodore Callahan had possessed an almost supernatural ability to read conditions and execute at extreme range. If she had inherited even a fraction of that capability, combined with the preparation she had done, it was theoretically possible. But theory and execution were separated by 1,000 things that could go wrong. Hayes turned back to Vera. He said if they authorized this, if they let her take the shot, and she missed, the operation was over. Command would pull them out, and Scorpion would vanish into the network of safe houses and smuggling routes that had protected him for 3 years. Hundreds of lives lost to his operations would continue mounting. But if they did nothing, if they let this opportunity pass while they repositioned for a conventional approach, the result would be the same. Scorpion would be gone. He asked if she could make the shot. Vera looked at her calculations, at the numbers that had consumed her for hours. She thought about her father, about the 10,000 hours of practice, about every lesson learned on every range. She said yes. She could make the shot. Hayes held her gaze, searching for doubt or hesitation. He found neither. The colonel nodded slowly, then told Rodriguez and Bennett to help her prepare. They had one chance, and they were going to give her every advantage possible. As the team moved into action, Vera felt the weight of what she had committed to settle onto her shoulders. Somewhere in that distant compound, Scorpion was moving through his morning, unaware that 4,000 meters away, an equation was being solved that would decide whether he saw another sunrise. The rifle they brought her was a modified system built for extreme long-range precision. Rodriguez carried it like sacred cargo, a weapon that had been maintained with obsessive care. The barrel was longer than standard issue, the stock adjustable in 6 different dimensions, and the scope mounted on top represented more advanced optics than Vera had ever worked with. Bennett followed with ammunition, match-grade rounds that had been stored in climate-controlled conditions to ensure consistency. They set up on the ridge where Vera had maintained her observation post, establishing a stable shooting platform using sandbags and a specialized rest system. Rodriguez worked methodically, checking every component, explaining the weapon's characteristics. The trigger pull was precisely 3 pounds. The barrel had been free-floated to eliminate contact points that could affect accuracy, and the scope offered variable magnification up to 45 power. Vera settled behind the rifle, feeling its weight and balance. It was heavier than what she typically trained with, built for stability rather than mobility. She adjusted the stock to fit her frame, shifted her position until the sight picture felt natural, then began the process of familiarizing herself with equipment she had never fired before. Rodriguez watched her movements, offering small corrections to her positioning. Bennett had set up a spotting scope beside her, his role to call wind and track the bullet's impact. He asked about her zero. Vera said the rifle had been zeroed at 1,000 meters, which meant she would need to dial in extreme elevation adjustments for the actual distance. Rodriguez handed her a ballistic calculator, but she shook her head. She had already run the numbers a dozen times. The calculations were locked in her mind. She began making adjustments to the scope, rotating the elevation turret with precise clicks. Each click represented a small fraction of angle change, and at 4,000 meters, small fractions became significant distances. She counted 147 clicks of elevation, compensating for the massive bullet drop over distance. Then she adjusted for windage, factoring in the prevailing crosswind that her 17 days of data had mapped in detail. Hayes arrived with updated intelligence. The figure they had identified on the roof had moved back inside the compound, but thermal imaging suggested he remained in the main building. Security patrols continued their rotation pattern. Unaware they were being observed from a distance most would consider safe. The colonel asked how long she needed to prepare. Vera said she was ready now, but the shot would be optimal in approximately 30 minutes when a morning thermal condition stabilized. The sun was warming the valley floor, creating rising air that would affect trajectory. She needed the atmosphere to settle into a predictable pattern before committing to the shot. Hayes nodded and said they would wait. 30 minutes was not long enough for Scorpion to leave, but it was long enough for a lot of things to go wrong. Rodriguez knelt beside her, his voice quiet. He said at this distance, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 8 seconds. During that time, wind could shift, the target could move, atmospheric conditions could change. She would have no way to adjust once the trigger was pulled. Everything had to be perfect in the moment of firing. and she had to trust that her calculations would hold true across 2.5 miles of unpredictable air. She understood the reality of what she was attempting. Standard sniper doctrine emphasized certainty, taking only shots where success probability exceeded 90%. This shot, even with perfect preparation, was probably 60% at best. Missing would mean mission failure, but more than that, it would validate every assumption that had kept her in support roles instead of operational positions. She would become the example people used when arguing against unconventional approaches. Bennett studied the compound through his spotting scope, tracking movement patterns. He said the security detail was disciplined but not paranoid. They were confident in their distance from any potential threat. The nearest known military position was over 8 kilometers away. The idea that someone could reach them from where Vera sat would seem impossible, which was exactly why it might work. The minutes crawled past. Vera remained behind the rifle, controlling her breathing, letting her heart rate settle into the slow rhythm she had trained for thousands of hours. Her father used to say that shooting was meditation with consequences. The mind had to be completely calm, free from doubt or distraction. There was only the target, the conditions, and the mathematics that connected them. She watched the wind flag she had positioned at intervals down the ridge, monitoring the air movement. The pattern was holding consistent with her predictions. The morning thermals had stabilized into the predictable flow she had documented over weeks of observation. Temperature was 72 degrees, humidity at 43%, barometric pressure steady. Every variable was being measured, accounted for, integrated into the solution. Hayes checked his watch and asked if she was ready. Vera said she needed the target to present himself. As if on cue, the figure emerged again onto the compound roof. This time he was alone, except for a single security officer who remained at respectful distance. The target moved to the same corner as before, looking out over the valley with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself beyond reach. Bennett confirmed identification through the spotting scope. The facial features matched intelligence photographs with high certainty. The posture and movement patterns were consistent with previous surveillance from 2 years ago. This was Scorpion, standing exposed in morning sunlight, unaware that 4,200 meters away, a young lieutenant was about to attempt the impossible. Rodriguez asked for wind call. Bennett studied his instruments and reported a 5 mph crosswind from the east, steady and consistent. Vera had already factored that into her calculations, but confirmation was essential. She made a minute adjustment to her scope, a final refinement based on real-time observation. She settled into the rifle, feeling the stock against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the rest with consistent pressure. Her right hand found the grip, finger resting along the receiver guard, not touching the trigger yet. Her left hand supported the fore end, keeping the weapon stable on its rest. Her breathing slowed to the deep, measured rhythm that preceded every shot she had ever taken. Through the scope, the compound leaped into crystal clarity. She could see the target's face, see the details of his clothing, see the casual way he surveyed the valley below. He shifted his weight slightly, and she tracked the movement with minute adjustments. The crosshairs center on his chest, the largest target area, the point where a hit would be certain regardless of last-second movement. Hayes spoke quietly, saying the decision was hers. She had authorization to fire when ready. There would be no countdown, no dramatic announcement. This was operational reality, where success or failure came down to a single moment of execution, and no one could share the burden of that decision except the person behind the rifle. Vera's finger moved to the trigger, feeling the precise 3-pound pull weight. She began taking up the slack, applying smooth rearward pressure. Her breathing cycled one last time, and at the natural pause between exhale and inhale, she found the still point where everything aligned. The mathematics, the preparation, the 10,000 hours of training, all of it converged into a single instant of perfect clarity. The trigger broke with a clean release that surprised even though she expected it. The rifle recoiled against her shoulder, a solid push that she absorbed through proper positioning. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley, a sharp crack that echoed off distant ridges. And then there was nothing to do but wait as the bullet began its 8-second journey through morning air, carrying with it the success or failure of everything she had worked toward. 8 seconds felt like forever. Vera remained perfectly still behind the rifle, maintaining her position, controlling the natural urge to lift her head and look. Bennett kept his eye pressed to the spotting scope, tracking the invisible path of the bullet as it arced through the morning air. Rodriguez stood frozen, binoculars raised, everyone on the ridge locked in suspended animation as physics played out across 2.5 miles of valley. The bullet traveled at 2,800 feet per second initially, but atmospheric drag worked against it constantly, bleeding away velocity with each meter covered. It dropped through the air in a precise parabolic curve, falling nearly 400 feet from its initial trajectory, while simultaneously being pushed sideways by the crosswind. The Coriolis effect added its subtle influence, the Earth's rotation creating forces that would have seemed like science fiction to shooters from earlier generations. Vera had calculated for all of it, every variable, every force acting on that small piece of copper and lead. But calculation and reality were different things, separated by 1,000 factors too small to measure and too complex to predict. A dust devil rising from the valley floor. A momentary thermal shift. A microscopic flaw in the bullet's jacket. Any of them could turn a perfect shot into a miss. At the compound, Scorpion remained on the roof, still looking out over the valley. The security officer near him shifted position slightly, saying something that did not carry across the distance. Morning sun painted everything in sharp relief, shadows crisp and defined. Birds circled over the buildings, thermal updrafts carrying them higher. Everything was ordinary, peaceful, completely unaware that death was traveling toward it at supersonic speed. 6 seconds. Bennett's knuckles were white where he gripped the spotting scope. Hayes stood absolutely still, his face showing nothing, but his breathing betrayed the tension. Rodriguez had stopped breathing entirely, holding himself in perfect stillness as if any movement might somehow affect the outcome. The ridge had become a tableau of frozen anticipation. The bullet continued its journey, shedding velocity but maintaining its deadly purpose. At 3,000 meters, it was still traveling faster than sound. At 3,500 meters, the drag had reduced its speed significantly, but it remained stable, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, gyroscopic stability, keeping it oriented properly. The wind pushed it, gravity pulled it, but the mathematics held true. 7 seconds. At the compound, Scorpion started to turn away from the edge. The movement was casual, unhurried, the motion of someone about to head back inside. The security officer gestured toward the door, suggesting it was time to move. In a few more seconds, the target would be gone, back into the building where walls would provide protection that distance could not overcome. Vera watched through her scope, still holding her position, seeing the target beginning to shift. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. There was nothing she could do now. The shot had been taken. The equation solved to the best of her ability. What happened next was in the hands of physics and fate. 8 seconds. The bullet arrived. The impact was visible even at 4,000 meters, a sudden spray of mist that appeared where the target had been standing. Scorpion collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, dropping to the roof surface without a sound that could be heard across the distance. The security officer froze for a half-second of incomprehension, then began screaming orders that reached no one who could help. Bennett said 2 words, quiet but certain. On target. Rodriguez lowered his binoculars, his face showing an expression somewhere between shock and awe. Hayes grabbed his radio, already calling for confirmation through intelligence channels, his voice steady despite what they had just witnessed. Vera remained behind the rifle, watching as the compound erupted into chaos. Security personnel poured onto the roof, surrounding the fallen figure. Someone was attempting medical intervention. Others were scanning the horizon, trying to identify where the shot had come from. The security officer who had been standing near Scorpion was pointing in completely the wrong direction, convinced the threat must be closer than physics would suggest possible. Rodriguez knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He said she had just made history, the longest confirmed kill shot ever recorded, and she had done it on equipment she had never fired before at a target she could barely see, with a bullet flight time that gave the target 8 seconds to move. He said her father would have been proud, but that did not begin to cover what she had just accomplished. Bennett was still watching through the spotting scope, narrating the scene at the compound. Medical personnel had arrived, but their efforts appeared futile. The security detail was evacuating the area, loading into vehicles with panicked urgency. Within minutes, the compound would be empty, everyone fleeing from a threat they could not see or understand. The operation that had lasted 17 days was ending in a matter of seconds, all because of one perfectly calculated shot. Hayes finished his radio call and approached Vera's position. Intelligence was confirming through multiple sources. Scorpion was down, no vital signs visible on thermal imaging. The security detail's communications, intercepted and translated in real time, confirmed what they were seeing. The target was dead, killed by a shot that should not have been possible. The colonel looked at Vera with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Respect, mixed with something like wonder. He said she had just saved the mission, accomplished an objective that was about to be written off as impossible. He asked how she felt. Vera lifted her head from the rifle, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. She said the numbers had worked. Everything else was just execution. Rodriguez laughed, a sound of released pressure and genuine admiration. He said she was understating what just happened. She had taken everything they knew about long-range shooting and pushed it into new territory. Sniper schools would be teaching this shot for decades. Her name would be in the record books, and more importantly, her calculations would be studied by every precision shooter in the world. Bennett secured the rifle, treating it with even more reverence than before. He said the weapon had just become a piece of history. The optics, the barrel, the stock, everything would be documented and preserved. But more than the equipment, what mattered was the mind behind it. Vera had proven that impossible was just another word for difficult, and difficult was solvable with enough preparation and skill. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the ridge where they stood. In the valley below, the compound was emptying rapidly, vehicles streaming away in all directions. Emergency response teams from the local area were converging on the site, but there was nothing they could do. Scorpion, the ghost who had evaded capture for 3 years, was gone. Not captured, not arrested, but eliminated by a bullet fired from a distance most people would struggle to see with the naked eye. Vera stood and stretched, feeling muscles that had been locked in position for hours. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. The shot that would define her career, that would open doors that had been closed, that would validate every hour of training and every calculation in her notebooks, was done. She had proven what her father had always told her. That skill was not about natural talent or inherited ability. It was about preparation meeting opportunity and being willing to take the shot when everyone else said it could not be made. Hayes began coordinating the extraction plan. They would need to move quickly before local forces figured out where the shot originated. But there was time for one thing first. He extended his hand to Vera, and when she took it, his grip was firm and his words were simple. He said, "Well done, Lieutenant." She had earned her place among the best, and no one would question that again. The extraction happened faster than Vera expected. Within 40 minutes of the shot, helicopters arrived to pull the team out of the forward operating base. Hayes had called in priority evacuation, knowing that once local forces analyzed the trajectory and determined the origin point, the ridge would become a target. They loaded equipment with practiced efficiency, leaving nothing behind that could provide intelligence value. Vera sat in the helicopter bay, the rifle case secured beside her, watching the valley drop away beneath them. Rodriguez sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. He had been quiet since they started packing, processing what he had witnessed. Bennett was already writing his after-action report on a tablet, documenting every detail while the memory was fresh. This would be studied, analyzed, and debated for years. The flight to the main operating base took 90 minutes, crossing mountain ranges and desert terrain that blurred together in the afternoon heat. Vera closed her eyes, feeling exhaustion settle over her like a weight. She had been awake for over 30 hours, the last 8 spent in a state of intense focus that left her drained. But her mind would not stop replaying the shot, analyzing every element, confirming that the outcome had matched her calculations. They landed at a sprawling base that hummed with activity, a different world from the isolated forward position they had left behind. Hayes led them directly to the operations center, where senior officers were already assembled to receive their report. The room fell silent when they entered, everyone turning to look at the small group that had just accomplished what multiple larger operations had failed to achieve. A Colonel Vera did not recognize asked for confirmation of the kill. Hayes provided the detailed account, supported by video footage, thermal imaging, and intercepted communications from the compound. The evidence was overwhelming. Scorpion was dead, eliminated by a single shot from 4,200 meters. The senior officers listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to astonishment as the full scope of what had happened became clear. The unrecognized colonel turned his attention to Vera. He asked if she understood the significance of what she had accomplished. She said she understood that the mission objective had been achieved. The colonel shook his head slightly. He said she had exceeded the mission objective by such a margin that it redefined what was considered possible in precision shooting. The previous record for confirmed long-range kill had stood for over a decade. She had exceeded it by more than 30%, using calculations and environmental analysis that represented a new methodology. A general entered the room, his presence immediately commanding attention. Everyone stood, and he waved them back to their seats before turning to Hayes. He asked for a brief summary. Hayes provided it in 3 sentences, each one landing with impact. The general looked at Vera for a long moment, then asked to see her environmental logs and calculations. She handed over her notebooks, the pages worn from constant use, filled with data collected over 17 days of observation. The general paged through them slowly, his expression unreadable. He passed them to an intelligence officer standing nearby, instructing him to have everything photographed and analyzed. These logs represented operational intelligence that could reshape long-range engagement protocols across all branches. The general said Vera would be receiving formal recognition for her actions, but more importantly, she would be reassigned immediately to advanced sniper training and development. Her support role designation was being removed, replaced with operational status and priority placement in specialized units. He asked if she had any requests. Vera glanced at Rodriguez and Bennett, then said she would like to work with her current team if possible. The general nodded and said that could be arranged. The debriefing lasted 3 hours, every detail documented and analyzed. Ballistics experts questioned her calculations, trying to understand her methodology. Intelligence officers wanted to know how she had identified the pattern that led to finding Scorpion. Equipment specialists examined the rifle, documenting its configuration and condition. Everyone wanted a piece of the story to understand how an impossible shot had been made routine through preparation and skill. Rodriguez and Bennett defended her against the more aggressive questioning, pushing back when experts implied luck had played a role. They had been there, had watched her work through the calculations, had seen the meticulous preparation. This was not luck, it was mastery applied to an extreme problem. The skeptics eventually backed down, unable to argue with results that spoke for themselves. When they were finally released, night had fallen over the base. Vera walked out of the operations center feeling like she had been wrung dry. Rodriguez caught up to her, falling into step beside her. He said the next few weeks would be intense. Every sniper instructor, every ballistics researcher, every tactical analyst would want to pick her brain. Her methodology would be studied and probably incorporated into training doctrine. She was about to become famous within a community that valued results above all else. Bennett joined them, carrying food from the mess hall. He said she needed to eat and sleep before the real circus started. Tomorrow morning, Command would start the formal process of documenting everything for the record. Her shot would be submitted for verification to independent organizations that track such things. Media would eventually get wind of it, though operational security would limit what could be shared publicly. They found a quiet corner of the base, sitting outside under stars that seemed impossibly bright after weeks in the field. Vera ate mechanically, her body recognizing its need for fuel even as her mind continued processing. Rodriguez asked what her father would have said about the shot. She was quiet for a moment, remembering his voice, his lessons, his absolute belief that mathematics and preparation could overcome any obstacle. She said her father would have asked about her wind calls and environmental calculations, then would have pointed out 3 things she could have done better. Rodriguez laughed, saying that sounded exactly like Theodore Callahan. The man had never been satisfied with success if there was room for improvement. It was what made him legendary, and apparently, that drive had been passed down. Bennett raised his water bottle in a toast. He said to Lieutenant Vera Callahan, who proved that impossible was just another target distance. Rodriguez joined the toast, and Vera found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. She had spent her entire military career fighting to be taken seriously, to be given opportunities to prove her capabilities. In 8 seconds, that fight had ended. Now came the harder challenge of living up to expectations that had just been set impossibly high. Hayes found them an hour later, his face showing the strain of the day. He said Vera's reassignment orders were already being processed at the highest priority. She would be staying on this base for 2 weeks of intensive debriefing and instruction sharing, then transferring to an advanced training facility where she would help develop new long-range engagement protocols. Her support role days were over. She was now considered a strategic asset. He sat down with them, the formality of rank temporarily suspended by a shared experience. He said he had commanded operations for 15 years and had seen exceptional performances by exceptional people. What Vera had done exceeded that by an order of magnitude. She had taken a failing mission and turned it into a historic success through nothing but observation, calculation, and the courage to attempt what others called impossible. Vera said she had only done what the numbers indicated was possible. Hayes shook his head. The numbers were meaningless without the skill to execute and the confidence to try. Plenty of people could run calculations. Few had the ability to trust those calculations enough to stake everything on a single trigger pull. That combination of technical mastery and operational courage was what separated competent shooters from legends. The night, air cooled as they sat talking, decompressing from the intensity of the past day. Somewhere in the distance, aircraft launched on night missions, the sound of engines echoing across the base. Life continued, operations proceeded, but for this small group, the world had shifted. They had been part of something that would be remembered, studied, and discussed for generations. A moment where preparation met opportunity, and the impossible became just another successful mission. Vera finally excused herself to find quarters and sleep. As she walked away, she heard Rodriguez say quietly to Hayes that Theodore Callahan would have been proud. Hayes agreed, adding that proud did not begin to cover it. His daughter had not just honored his legacy. She had exceeded it in a way that would establish her own. The next morning arrived too early. Vera woke to a knock on her door at 05:30. A sergeant informing her that the base commander wanted to see her at 0600. She showered quickly, put on a fresh uniform, and tried to ignore the surreal feeling that had settled over everything. 24 hours ago, she had been assigned to equipment management. Now she was being summoned by a 2-star general. The commander's office overlooked the flight line, floor-to-ceiling windows providing a view of early morning operations. General Patricia Hendricks stood when Vera entered, which felt wrong on multiple levels. Generals did not stand for lieutenants. But Hendricks gestured to a chair and sat across from her rather than behind her desk, eliminating the formal barrier of rank. Hendricks said she had spent most of the night reviewing Vera's file, her training records, and the 17 days of environmental logs that had led to yesterday's shot. What she found was a pattern of exceptional capability consistently overlooked because of assumptions about age, gender, and appropriate roles. The general asked bluntly why Vera had accepted support assignments when her qualifications clearly indicated operational capability. Vera considered her answer carefully. She said she had learned that fighting for recognition often cost more than it gained. Better to do the work assigned, maintain excellence, and wait for opportunity. Hendricks nodded slowly, saying that was a mature approach but also a wasteful one. The military could not afford to sideline talent because of institutional bias. What happened yesterday proved that point definitively. The general explained that Vera's reassignment was just the beginning. The shot had attracted attention at the highest levels of command. Pentagon analysts were already modeling her methodology, trying to understand how she had achieved what was previously considered beyond human capability. Within 48 hours, she would be asked to present her approach to a joint service conference on precision engagement. Every branch wanted to understand her techniques. Hendricks said the attention would be intense, and not all of it would be positive. Some people would claim luck, others would question the verification, and a few would resent that a relatively junior officer had accomplished something senior snipers had not. Vera needed to be prepared for skepticism, for demands that she replicate her success, for pressure to prove that yesterday was skill rather than accident. Vera said she understood. She also said that she could replicate the shot given similar preparation time and environmental conditions. The mathematics were sound, the methodology was reproducible, and the variables were measurable. Hendricks smiled slightly, saying that confidence would serve her well. She would need it when facing people who had spent decades in precision shooting roles and were now being told that their understanding of limits had been wrong. The general stood and walked to the window, watching aircraft taxi for takeoff. She said Vera reminded her of herself 30 years ago, fighting to be taken seriously in a field that assumed women could not perform at the highest levels. Hendricks had commanded combat units, planned major operations, and earned her stars through demonstrated excellence. But it had been exhausting, constantly proving herself, constantly exceeding standards just to be considered equal. She turned back to Vera and said the shot yesterday had changed the equation. Vera would face challenges, but she had already proven her capability in a way that could not be dismissed or diminished. The question now was what she wanted to do with that proof. She could accept operational assignments and continue developing her skills, or she could move into training and methodology development, teaching others what she knew. Both paths were open, and both would be valuable. Vera said she wanted operational work. Training was important, but she had not spent 10,000 hours perfecting her skills to spend the rest of her career in a classroom. Hendricks nodded approvingly, saying that was the answer she had hoped for. The military needed operators who could push boundaries, not just teachers who explained existing doctrine. The general returned to her desk and pulled out a folder. She said Vera was being offered a position with a Joint Special Operations Unit that specialized in extreme-range precision engagement. The unit worked on missions where conventional approaches failed, where distance and difficulty required unconventional solutions. They needed someone who could see possibilities others missed, who could turn impossible problems into solvable equations. The assignment would be voluntary, Hendricks emphasized. It would be dangerous, would involve missions that could not be discussed, and would require Vera to work with teams from multiple branches and allied nations. But it would also give her opportunities to refine her methodology, to work with the best equipment available, and to tackle challenges that would make yesterday's shot look simple by comparison. Vera asked where she would start. Hendricks said immediately after the conference presentation, assuming Vera accepted the position. There was paperwork to complete, clearances to update, and training to undergo, but the unit wanted her as soon as possible. They had watched the video of her shot and recognized something their current roster lacked. Not just skill, but the intellectual approach to problem-solving that turned tactical challenges into mathematical exercises. Rodriguez knocked on the door, entering when Hendricks called. He said the ballistics team was ready to begin their analysis session with Vera. Hendricks told them to give them 10 more minutes, then turned back to Vera. She asked if there were any questions. Vera had dozens, but most of them were not appropriate for this moment. Instead, she asked if the unit had a history of accepting her recommendations rather than dismissing them. Hendricks laughed, a genuine sound that made her seem less like a general and more like someone who understood the question behind the question. She said the unit existed precisely because conventional wisdom often failed in unconventional situations. They valued people who thought differently, who saw solutions others missed. Vera would not have to fight to be heard. She would be expected to challenge assumptions and propose alternatives. That was the job. Rodriguez said they really needed to start the analysis session. Hendricks dismissed Vera, saying to think about the offer and provide an answer within 24 hours. As Vera stood to leave, the general added one more thing. She said Theodore Callahan had once told her that the best snipers were not the ones with perfect eyes or steady hands. They were the ones who understood that every shot was a question, and the answer was found in preparation, calculation, and the courage to execute when others hesitated. Vera froze, then asked when Hendricks had known her father. The general said they had worked together on a classified operation 15 years ago. Theodore had been the finest precision shooter she had ever seen, and more importantly, he had been someone who understood that skill without confidence was wasted potential. She said she saw that same combination in Vera, refined and improved by a generation of better training and technology. The analysis session consumed the rest of the morning. Ballistics experts walked through every aspect of the shot, documenting her calculations and comparing them to actual results. The correlation was almost perfect, her predictions matching reality within margins of error so small they impressed even the most skeptical analysts. They asked about her methodology, her data collection techniques, her approach to environmental analysis. Vera explained her system, the 17 days of observation that had built a comprehensive understanding of the valley's atmospheric conditions. She described how she had mapped wind patterns by watching dust movement, measuring thermal layers through mirage distortion, and calculating air density changes from temperature and humidity data. Every piece of information had fed into her model, creating a predictive capability that exceeded what standard meteorological equipment could provide. One analyst asked if she had used any classified or experimental techniques. Vera said everything she did was based on publicly available physics and mathematics. The difference was in the thoroughness of application. Most shooters made good enough calculations for their engagement distances. She had made perfect calculations because perfect was what 4,000 meters required. By lunch, the analysts were satisfied. They had documented her methodology, verified her mathematics, and confirmed that the shot was reproducible given similar preparation. Their report would state definitively that Lieutenant Callahan had achieved the longest confirmed precision kill in military history through skill, preparation, and technical mastery. There was no luck involved, no unexplained factors. Just exceptional work applied to an exceptional challenge. Bennett found her in the mess hall, carrying 2 trays of food. He sat down and said the entire base was talking about her. Stories were already circulating, some accurate, others wildly exaggerated. Someone claimed she had made the shot in a sandstorm. Another said the target had been running. Bennett had spent the morning correcting misinformation, but it was like fighting a flood with a bucket. Vera said the truth was impressive enough without embellishment. Bennett agreed, but said people loved legends more than facts. She was becoming a legend whether she wanted to or not. The question was whether she could live with that reality. Vera thought about Hendricks' offer, about the unit that valued unconventional thinking, about missions that would make yesterday look simple. She realized she had already made her decision. The Joint Service Conference took place in a secure facility 2 days later. Vera stood backstage, listening to the murmur of voices from the auditorium beyond. Rodriguez stood beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He said the audience would include some of the most experienced precision shooters in all branches of military service. People who had spent their entire careers mastering their craft. They would be skeptical, protective of their expertise, resistant to being told that their understanding of limitations had been wrong. Vera said she was only presenting what she had done, not claiming to rewrite doctrine. Rodriguez shook his head slightly. Whether she intended it or not, that was exactly what she was doing. Her shot represented a fundamental shift in what was considered achievable. The implications went beyond one successful engagement. If her methodology was teachable, if her results were reproducible, then every long-range doctrine would need revision. A colonel appeared, saying it was time. Vera walked onto the stage, facing an auditorium filled with uniforms representing every branch. The lighting made it difficult to see individual faces, but she could feel the weight of their attention. General Hendricks sat in the front row, her expression neutral but supportive. Hayes was there, along with Bennett and the entire team that had been part of the operation. Vera began with the basics, explaining the mission parameters and the challenge they had faced. Scorpion had evaded capture for 3 years through unpredictable movement patterns and careful operational security. Standard approaches had failed repeatedly. What was needed was a different methodology, one that looked at patterns most people ignored. Infrastructure, environmental conditions, and the mathematical relationship between observation and prediction. She displayed her environmental logs, 17 days of data collection showing wind patterns, thermal layers, atmospheric pressure changes, and their correlation with human activity in the valley. The audience leaned forward, studying the information with professional interest. This was not theoretical discussion. This was operational intelligence gathered under real conditions for a real mission. One of the officers interrupted, asking why infrastructure patterns mattered for target location. Vera explained that people were predictable even when they tried not to be. They needed power, water, fuel, and communications. Those needs created patterns that could be mapped and predicted. Scorpion had avoided signals intelligence by limiting electronic communications, but he could not avoid needing electricity, and electricity use created detectable patterns. She walked them through her analysis, showing how she had identified the Western Compound as a probable location based on generator maintenance schedules and power consumption patterns. The prediction had been precise enough to identify not just the day, but the approximate time window when the target would be present. That precision had made the shot possible by eliminating the variables of timing and uncertainty. Another officer asked about the shot itself. 4,200 meters exceeded established doctrine by significant margins. What made her think it was achievable? Vera displayed her ballistic calculations, the environmental data, the equipment specifications. She explained how she had measured every variable, accounted for every force acting on the bullet, and built a predictive model that approached the accuracy of laboratory conditions. The mathematics were complex, but not mysterious. Bullet drop, wind drift, Coriolis effect, air density, temperature gradients. Every factor was quantifiable and calculable. The challenge was not the physics. It was having sufficient data to feed into the equations. Her 17 days of observation had provided that data with unprecedented completeness. A Marine colonel stood, his expression challenging. He said mathematics were fine in theory, but shooting was not a classroom exercise. Variables existed that could not be measured or predicted. Atmospheric anomalies, equipment variations, human factors. At extreme range, those unmeasured variables accumulated until success became more about luck than skill. How did she account for that reality? Vera met his gaze directly. She said luck was what you called success when you did not understand all the variables involved. She had measured atmospheric conditions continuously for 17 days, building models that predicted behavior with high accuracy. She had used match-grade ammunition stored in controlled conditions to eliminate equipment variation. She had trained for thousands of hours to minimize human factors. What remained was not luck. It was the small margin of uncertainty that existed in any real-world application of physics. The colonel sat down slowly, not entirely convinced, but unable to argue with results. Rodriguez had been right. These were people who had built careers on established doctrine, and accepting that doctrine had been incomplete was difficult. But the video footage did not lie. The ballistic analysis did not lie. The mathematical correlation between prediction and outcome did not lie. Vera continued her presentation, showing how her methodology could be applied to other situations. The key was thoroughness of preparation. Most operations did not allow 17 days of observation, but even limited data collection using her techniques would improve accuracy at extended ranges. She was not suggesting every engagement should be at 4,000 meters. She was demonstrating that with proper preparation, ranges previously considered impossible became merely difficult. A Navy SEAL asked about training implications. If her methodology was teachable, how long would it take to train shooters to her level? Vera said the mathematical analysis could be taught in weeks. The environmental observation skills would take months to develop. The confidence to execute at extreme range, to trust calculations over instinct, that would take years and depended on individual capability. Not everyone could make the shot she had made, but many could improve their effective range significantly using her techniques. Hendricks stood, commanding immediate attention. She said the analysis team had verified Lieutenant Callahan's methodology and confirmed its validity. The shot was not an unrepeatable fluke. It was a demonstration of what became possible when exceptional preparation met exceptional skill. The military would be incorporating her techniques into advanced training programs, and her willingness to share her knowledge was as impressive as her shooting ability. The general said Vera represented the kind of thinking the military needed more of, not just following established procedures, but questioning limitations and finding solutions others missed. Her shot had eliminated a high-value target and saved countless lives by ending a terrorist operation. But more than that, she had advanced the entire field of precision engagement by proving what was achievable. The presentation ended with sustained applause, genuine recognition from people who understood exactly how difficult what she had accomplished truly was. Vera left the stage feeling drained but satisfied. She had faced their skepticism, answered their challenges, and earned their respect through demonstration rather than assertion. Rodriguez met her backstage with a bottle of water and a smile. He said she had handled the Marine colonel perfectly. That was a man who had been teaching sniper school for 15 years, and she had just made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about long-range capability. Not through arrogance or dismissiveness, but through patient explanation of reproducible methodology. Bennett appeared with Hayes, both of them looking pleased. Hayes said the conference had accomplished more than just validating her shot. It had shifted the conversation about what precision shooters could achieve. Doctrine would change, training would evolve, and equipment development would push toward enabling the capabilities she had demonstrated. She had not just made history. She had influenced the future. A captain approached, introducing himself as the executive officer of the Special Operations Unit Hendricks had mentioned. He said they had watched her presentation with great interest. Her approach to problem-solving, her comfort with complex mathematics, and her ability to execute under pressure were exactly what they needed. He asked if she had made a decision about the assignment. Vera said she had. She wanted operational work, wanted to continue developing her skills, wanted to tackle challenges that pushed boundaries. The captain nodded, saying they had plenty of those. He handed her a folder containing preliminary assignment details. She would report to their facility in 2 weeks after completing final documentation and clearance updates. Her first mission briefing would focus on a target in a mountainous region where conventional approaches had failed. They needed someone who could see solutions others missed. As the auditorium emptied, Vera stood looking at the folder at the beginning of something she had worked toward her entire career. Not just acceptance, not just recognition, but the opportunity to do the work she was built for. To take impossible problems and turn them into solvable equations. To prove that limits were often just failures of imagination combined with insufficient preparation. Rodriguez put a hand on her shoulder, saying her father would have loved this moment. Watching her stand in front of the best precision shooters in the military and teach them something new. Vera smiled slightly, remembering her father's voice, his lessons, his absolute belief that excellence was achievable through dedication and mathematical precision. She said he would have pointed out 3 things she could have explained better in her presentation, then told her to get back to work. That was his way, never satisfied, always pushing, always believing that good enough was never actually good enough. Hayes gathered the team, saying they had earned leave time after the intensity of the past weeks. But first, there would be a formal ceremony recognizing their achievement. Medals, commendations, and public acknowledgement of mission success. The political leadership wanted to demonstrate that persistence and unconventional thinking produced results. Vera would be at the center of that ceremony, representing everything the military claimed to value: innovation, expertise, and mission accomplishment. The ceremony took place 1 week later at the main headquarters compound. Vera stood in dress uniform, feeling awkward under the attention of cameras and senior officials. The base theater had been converted into a formal venue, filled with military personnel and select media representatives. This was not just about recognizing a successful mission. It was about demonstrating capability and boosting morale across all branches. General Hendricks presided over the ceremony, her voice carrying the weight of authority and genuine pride. She described the mission, carefully omitting operational details that remained classified, but conveying the challenge and the outcome. A target that had evaded capture for 3 years, eliminated by precision and planning. An impossible shot made possible through exceptional skill and preparation. Rodriguez and Bennett received commendations for their roles in the operation, their support and expertise contributing to mission success. Hayes was recognized for leadership and decision-making under pressure, for having the courage to authorize an unconventional approach when traditional methods failed. The entire team stood on stage, but everyone knew this ceremony centered on one person. Hendricks called Vera forward. The general held a medal case, the contents representing formal recognition of extraordinary achievement. She described Vera's 17 days of observation, the pattern analysis that located the target, and the 4th centimeter shot that ended the operation. Then she spoke about what the achievement meant beyond one mission, about pushing boundaries, about questioning assumed limitations, about demonstrating that excellence came from preparation and courage combined. The medal was pinned to Vera's uniform, weight and metal representing something more than decoration. Recognition that she had earned her place, proved her capabilities, and opened doors that had been closed. Hendricks shook her hand, the gesture formal, but the respect in her eyes completely genuine. She said quietly, so only Vera could hear, that Theodore Callahan would have been insufferably proud, and that Vera should prepare herself because the requests for her expertise were already overwhelming the assignment office. The audience applauded, the sound echoing in the theater. Vera returned to her position with the team, feeling Rodriguez's supportive presence beside her. The ceremony continued with remarks from other senior officers, each emphasizing different aspects of the mission: innovation, teamwork, persistence, and the importance of utilizing all available talent regardless of assumptions about appropriate roles. After the formal proceedings ended, the reception became less structured. Officers from various branches approached Vera, introducing themselves and asking about her methodology. Some were genuinely interested in learning, wanting to understand how they could apply her techniques to their own operations. Others were more skeptical, probing for weaknesses in her approach or circumstances that made replication unlikely. A lieutenant colonel from Army Sniper School asked detailed questions about her environmental data collection. He wanted to know if her techniques could be condensed into a training module, something that could be taught to advanced students. Vera explained that the observation skills were trainable but required significant practice. Reading atmospheric conditions accurately meant understanding subtle visual cues that took time to develop. She offered to consult on curriculum development if it would help improve training outcomes. A group of Navy officers questioned her about maritime applications. Did her methodology translate to shots from ships where the shooting platform was moving and environmental conditions were even more complex. Vera admitted that added significant variables she had not yet worked with. But the fundamental approach remained valid. Measure everything measurable, model what could be predicted, and execute with precision. The specific techniques would need adaptation for maritime environments, but the philosophy was universal. Bennett intercepted her before the questions became overwhelming, steering her toward a quieter corner where Hayes waited with Rodriguez. The colonel said she was handling the attention well, but she needed to pace herself. The next 2 weeks would be filled with requests for interviews, consultations, and appearances. Command wanted to leverage her success for recruitment and training purposes. She would need to learn how to manage those demands while maintaining focus on her actual work. Rodriguez said the Special Operations Unit had already sent 3 messages asking when she would report. They had missions queued that needed her specific capabilities. The political recognition was necessary, but operational units cared more about what she could do next than what she had already done. Vera appreciated that perspective. The ceremony was meaningful, but it represented past achievement. She was more interested in future challenges. A civilian approached, identifying himself as a defense contractor specializing in precision rifle systems. He said his company was developing next-generation platforms specifically designed for extreme-range engagement. They wanted to work with her to understand what equipment capabilities would best support her methodology. Would she be willing to consult on the project? Vera said she would need to clear it through her chain of command, but she was interested in anything that improved operational effectiveness. Hendricks reappeared, diplomatically extracting Vera from the growing crowd of people wanting her time. The general led her to a private office, closing the door on the noise of the reception. She poured 2 glasses of water and sat down with the informal posture that indicated this was not an official conversation. Hendricks said Vera needed to understand something about what happened next. Fame, even within the military community, changed relationships and created expectations. People would want things from her: her time, her expertise, her endorsement of their programs or equipment. Some requests would be legitimate and valuable. Others would be attempts to leverage her reputation for purposes that did not serve her interests or the mission. The general said learning to distinguish between the two was a skill Vera would need to develop quickly. She should be generous with sharing knowledge that improved operational capability. She should be cautious about commitments that consume time without producing value. And she should never forget that her primary purpose was operational excellence, not public relations or political symbolism. Vera asked how Hendricks had managed that balance. The general smiled, saying imperfectly and with considerable frustration. But she had learned to protect her time, to say no to demands that did not serve the mission, and to remember that recognition was a byproduct of good work, not the goal itself. Vera should take the same approach. Let her results speak, share her knowledge where it helped, and stay focused on doing the work that mattered. Hendricks said the Special Operations assignment would provide some protection from the demands. That unit operated with different rules, more autonomy, and less public visibility. Vera would have space to develop her capabilities without constant interruption. But first, she needed to survive the next 2 weeks of ceremony, interviews, and political attention. The general offered her advice when needed and interference when requests became unreasonable. They returned to the reception together, and Vera felt more grounded. The attention was overwhelming, but it was temporary. What mattered was the work ahead, the missions that would challenge her capabilities and push her skills further. The ceremony was acknowledgement of what she had done. The assignment waiting for her was the opportunity to discover what she could become. Rodriguez found her again near the end of the evening. He said he had been thinking about her presentation at the conference, about her willingness to share methodology that gave her a competitive advantage. Most people in her position would have protected that knowledge, used it to maintain their edge. She had done the opposite, openly teaching techniques that could make others as capable as she was. Vera said capability should not be competitive. The mission was what mattered, and anything that improved mission success should be shared freely. if her techniques helped other shooters make better shots that served the larger purpose. Personal recognition was less important than operational effectiveness. Rodriguez nodded, saying that attitude would serve her well in the special operations community. They valued people who elevated everyone around them rather than hoarding advantages. Bennett joined them, saying transport was arranged for the morning. Vera would fly to the special operations facility, begin integration with her new unit, and start mission preparation. The past 3 weeks had been extraordinary, from finding Scorpion to making history to receiving formal recognition. But all of it was prologue. The real work was about to begin. Hayes approached with a final message. He said command had approved the entire team for transfer to the Special Operations Unit if they chose to accept. Rodriguez and Bennett were being offered positions based on their performance during the operation and their ability to work effectively with Vera. The unit wanted the team intact, recognizing that the relationships they had built contributed to mission success. Rodriguez and Bennett exchanged glances, then both nodded. They were in. Whatever challenges came next, they would face them together. Hayes said he would remain in his current command, but he would be following their careers with interest. He predicted they would accomplish things that made the Scorpion operation look routine. Vera hoped he was right, not because she wanted more recognition, but because difficult missions meant important work. And important work was what she had spent her entire life preparing to do. The Special Operations Facility looked nothing like a traditional military base. Hidden in mountainous terrain, it consisted of scattered buildings designed to blend with the landscape, connected by roads that appeared more like hiking trails. Security was omnipresent but subtle. Observation posts and sensor arrays integrated into the natural environment. This was a place built for people who operated in shadows, who solved problems conventional forces could not touch. Vera arrived with Rodriguez and Bennett. The three of them processed through multiple security checkpoints before being cleared for entry. The captain who had approached her after the conference met them at the operations center, introducing himself properly as Captain Marcus Webb. He had been with the unit for 6 years, coordinating missions that pushed the boundaries of what special operations could accomplish. Webb led them through the facility, explaining its purpose and organization. The unit drew personnel from all branches, selecting individuals with specialized capabilities that complemented each other. They had intelligence analysts who could find patterns in chaos, communication specialists who could operate in denied environments, tactical operators who thrived in impossible situations, and precision shooters who could engage targets beyond conventional limits. Vera and her team would integrate into that mix, adding capabilities the unit currently lacked. He showed them the ranges, facilities that made conventional training areas look primitive, electronic target systems that could simulate movement at any distance, environmental chambers that could reproduce atmospheric conditions from Arctic cold to desert heat, ballistic laboratories with equipment for testing and validating shot solutions under controlled circumstances. Everything designed to push operators to their maximum capability and beyond. Rodriguez whistled softly, his appreciation evident. He said, "This was where serious work happened, where people who were already exceptional came to become extraordinary." Webb agreed, adding that the expectation was total commitment to excellence. Mediocrity was not tolerated because missions did not allow for it. When they deployed, failure meant lives lost and objectives unmet. Success required everyone performing at levels most people considered impossible. They met the unit's other precision shooters, a group of 5 men and 1 woman who had heard about Vera's shot and wanted to understand her methodology. The questions started immediately, technical and probing. How had she calculated Coriolis effect with such precision? What software had she used for ballistic modeling? How did she account for elevation-induced pressure changes across the bullet's flight path? Vera answered patiently, walking through her approach step by step. She had not used software for the final calculations, preferring to work them manually to ensure she understood every variable. The Coriolis effect, at that latitude and distance, required accounting for Earth's rotation, a factor that became significant beyond 3,000 meters. Elevation changes meant air density variations, which affected drag coefficient and required adjustments to her trajectory model. One of the shooters, a Marine named Sergeant Kyle Oakes, asked about her confidence level before taking the shot. Vera said her calculations indicated an 80% probability of first-round hit within the target zone. Oakes looked impressed, saying most shooters would consider 50% acceptable at that range. Vera explained that 80% was the minimum threshold her father had taught her to accept. Below that, the shot was not worth taking because mission risk outweighed success probability. The female shooter, Chief Petty Officer Lauren Voss from the Navy, asked about training progression. How had Vera developed the confidence to trust her calculations at extreme range? Vera said it came from thousands of repetitions at progressively increasing distances, always documenting results and refining her models. Every shot was a data point, every miss was a learning opportunity, and every success validated methodology. Over time, the correlation between calculation and outcome became predictable enough to trust even at distances she had never attempted. Webb interrupted the technical discussion, saying there would be plenty of time for knowledge sharing. Right now, he needed to brief them on their first mission. They moved to a secure conference room, walls covered with maps and imagery of a mountainous region Vera did not immediately recognize. Webb identified it as a border area where hostile forces were using terrain to avoid detection and engagement. Intelligence had located a training camp in a valley accessible only through narrow passes that were heavily monitored. Conventional forces could not approach without being detected. Airstrikes risked civilian casualties because the camp was near a village. What was needed was precision elimination of specific high-value individuals while leaving the larger infrastructure intact. The ranges involved were extreme, the environmental conditions challenging, and the margin for error was zero. Webb said they had been planning this mission for 6 weeks, but had not identified a viable approach until Vera's shot demonstrated new possibilities. Her methodology for environmental analysis and extreme-range engagement offered a solution that had not existed before. If she could make the shot that eliminated Scorpion, she could make the shots this mission required. The question was whether she was ready to deploy again so soon after her previous operation. Vera studied the maps and imagery, her mind already working through the tactical problem. She asked about observation positions, environmental data availability, and time available for mission preparation. Webb said they had 3 weeks before the target window closed. Intelligence suggested the high-value individuals would be present during that window for a training evolution. After that, they would disperse and the opportunity would be lost. Rodriguez asked about team composition. Webb said the mission would include Vera as primary shooter, Rodriguez as spotter, Bennett on secondary systems, and 4 additional operators for security and communications. They would insert via helicopter to a position approximately 6 kilometers from the target area, establish observation for environmental data collection, then execute when conditions were optimal. Extraction would be immediate after shots were fired, before hostile forces could respond. Bennett wanted to know about rules of engagement. Webb said they were clear. Designated targets only, positive identification required before engagement, and immediate abort if civilian presence was detected in the impact zone. This was surgical work, not area suppression. Precision mattered more than speed, and accuracy was the only acceptable standard. Vera said 3 weeks was adequate for preparation if she could access the environmental data collection equipment she needed. Webb said anything she required would be provided. The unit had resources that conventional forces could only dream about, and those resources existed to enable missions like this. If she needed specialized optics, custom ammunition, or advanced meteorological equipment, it would be delivered within 48 hours. Oakes offered to work with her on preparation, sharing his experience with mountain shooting and the specific challenges of high-altitude precision work. Voss volunteered her expertise on cold weather equipment and maintaining accuracy when operating in extreme conditions. The unit was already functioning as a team, everyone contributing their knowledge to improve overall capability. Webb said they would begin detailed mission planning the next morning. Tonight, Vera and her team should settle into their quarters, familiarize themselves with the facility, and prepare for an intensive 3 weeks of preparation. He emphasized that this mission would be more challenging than the Scorpion operation. Multiple targets, longer ranges, worse weather, and higher stakes. But if anyone could accomplish it, the team in this room represented the best chance of success. As they left the conference room, Rodriguez said quietly that this was what they had trained for. Not recognition or ceremony, but missions that mattered and challenges that pushed them to their limits. Vera agreed, feeling a sense of rightness about being here. The Special Operations Facility was not about politics or public image. It was about operational excellence in service of critical missions. Bennett said they had 3 weeks to make themselves ready for something harder than anything they had done before. The Scorpion shot had been historic, but it had also been a single target in relatively stable conditions. This mission involved multiple targets in a hostile environment with limited margin for error. Success would require everything they had learned and everything they could still discover about their capabilities. Vera stood looking at the mountains surrounding the facility, thinking about the challenges ahead. The past 3 weeks had been transformative, taking her from a support role to operational assignment and formal recognition. But all of that was preparation for this moment, for missions that required the skills she had spent 10,000 hours developing. She had proven she could make an impossible shot. Now she would prove she could do it repeatedly, under worse conditions with higher stakes. Rodriguez put a hand on her shoulder, saying they would figure it out together. That was what teams did. They combined their strengths, covered each other's weaknesses, and accomplished things no individual could achieve alone. Vera had the technical expertise and the shooting ability. He would provide spotting and environmental analysis. Bennett would manage equipment and secondary systems. Together, they would make the mission succeed. Webb found them watching the sunset over the mountains. He said the unit had a tradition for new members. A dinner where everyone shared the story of their hardest mission, the moment that defined them as operators. Tonight would be Vera's turn to share, and then she would hear from people who had been doing this work for years. He said it was humbling and inspiring in equal measure, a reminder that everyone in this unit had earned their place through extraordinary performance under pressure. The dinner took place in a room that felt more like a mountain lodge than a military facility. Stone fireplace, wooden beams, comfortable seating arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal hierarchy. The entire unit gathered, about 30 people representing the full spectrum of special operations capabilities. They welcomed Vera and her team with genuine warmth, the camaraderie of professionals who understood what it meant to operate at the edge of human capability. Webb started the tradition by telling his story, a mission in dense jungle where his team had been surrounded and cut off from support. They had survived through innovation, using unconventional tactics and refusing to accept that their situation was hopeless. The story was harrowing and inspiring, a reminder that impossible was just another word for difficult, and difficult was solvable through skill and determination. Others shared their moments. Oakes described a mountain rescue operation where he had made a shot that saved a trapped operator's life, threading a bullet between rocks to eliminate a hostile fighter who had pinned down the rescue team. Voss talked about a maritime interdiction where she had maintained precision accuracy from a moving boat in rough seas, stopping a weapons shipment that would have armed terrorist cells across 3 countries. Each story reinforced the same message. This unit existed because conventional approaches sometimes failed, and when they did, specialized capabilities made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Everyone here had proven themselves under conditions that would have broken most people. That shared experience created bonds stronger than rank or service branch. When Vera's turn came, she spoke about the 17 days of observation that had led to finding Scorpion. She described the frustration of being dismissed, the persistence of collecting data no one valued, and a moment when that data revealed a pattern that changed everything. She talked about the fourth Osameter shot not as a demonstration of personal skill, but as validation that preparation and methodology could overcome what others called impossible. She told them about her father, about the 10,000 hours of training, about learning that excellence was not inherited but built through dedication and absolute commitment to understanding every variable. She said the shot that had brought her here was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of discovering what she could accomplish when surrounded by people who shared her commitment to operational excellence. The room was quiet when she finished. Then Webb raised his glass and said to Lieutenant Callahan, who proved that limitations were often just failures of imagination. The unit joined the toast, and Vera felt something shift inside her. This was where she belonged, not fighting for recognition or proving herself to skeptics, but working alongside people who valued capability over assumptions and results over politics. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite moment, or share if you have witnessed someone accomplish the impossible when others doubted them. The evening continued with conversation that ranged from technical discussions of methodology to stories that had nothing to do with military operations. These were people who trusted each other completely, who knew that when they deployed, their lives depended on everyone performing at their highest level. That trust created a culture where knowledge was shared freely, where asking for help was strength rather than weakness, and where individual excellence served team success. Later, Vera stood outside looking at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the mountain air. Rodriguez joined her, silent for a moment before speaking. He said 3 weeks ago she had been assigned to equipment management, underutilized and underestimated. Now, she was part of a unit that represented the highest level of special operations capability. The transformation was remarkable, but what impressed him most was that success had not changed her fundamental approach. She remained focused on the work, on preparation and methodology, on making herself better rather than satisfied. Vera said there was always more to learn, more variables to understand, more capabilities to develop. The Scorpion shot had been significant, but it represented one data point. The mission Webb had briefed would provide more data, more opportunities to refine her techniques, and discover what she was truly capable of. That was what drove her, not recognition or fame, but the pursuit of mastery that never ended. Bennett appeared with coffee, saying they should review the mission parameters before sleep. 3 weeks sounded like a lot of time, but they needed to absorb a massive amount of information about the target area, the environmental conditions, and the specific challenges of mountain precision shooting. Oakes and Voss had offered to spend the next day walking them through their experience with high-altitude operations, sharing lessons learned from years of difficult missions. They returned inside and spent 2 hours reviewing maps, imagery, and intelligence reports. The target area was brutally challenging, with elevation changes that created unpredictable wind patterns and temperature variations that affected bullet trajectory in complex ways. The ranges involved exceeded even the Scorpion shot, and they would be engaging multiple targets in sequence, which meant minimal time between shots and no opportunity for adjustment based on first-round results. Vera made notes, identifying the specific environmental data she would need to collect. Wind patterns at multiple elevations, temperature gradients through the mountain passes, air density measurements at target altitude, and detailed terrain mapping to understand how geography would affect atmospheric conditions. The 17 days she had spent observing the valley before the Scorpion mission had been thorough, but this operation would require even more comprehensive preparation. Webb joined them near midnight, reviewing their initial analysis. He said they were asking the right questions and identifying the correct priorities. The mission was feasible, but only if preparation was flawless. They would have one chance to execute, and anything less than perfect performance would mean mission failure. He asked if Vera understood the pressure that created. She said pressure was just another variable to account for, managed through preparation and confidence in methodology. The captain smiled, saying she was going to fit in well here. The unit thrived on challenges that others considered too difficult, And they succeeded because everyone brought that same attitude. Treat pressure as solvable rather than overwhelming, and suddenly impossible missions became merely hard. Hard was doable. Hard just required work. Over the next 3 weeks, Vera immersed herself in preparation. She spent hours on the range with Oaks, learning how altitude affected both shooter and equipment. She worked with Voss on cold weather techniques, discovering how temperature extremes changed everything from ammunition performance to human physiology. She studied meteorological data from the target region, building models of wind behavior and atmospheric conditions that became more refined with each day of analysis. Rodriguez and Bennett integrated with the team, each finding their role in the mission structure. They trained together, ate together, and spent countless hours discussing scenarios and contingencies. The unit operated with an intensity that made conventional military training seem casual, but nobody complained. They were here because they wanted to be, because this work mattered and required everything they could give. As the mission date approached, Vera felt ready in a way she had never experienced before. Not just technically prepared, but surrounded by people who understood and supported her approach. The Scorpion operation had proven her methodology worked. This mission would prove it was repeatable, scalable, and applicable to even more challenging circumstances. Success would mean saving lives, disrupting hostile operations, and demonstrating that precision and preparation could overcome any tactical obstacle. The night before deployment, Webb gathered the mission team for final brief. He reminded them that they represented capabilities that existed nowhere else in the world. What they were about to attempt would be studied for years, regardless of outcome. But outcome mattered, and they had prepared themselves to succeed. He said he had complete confidence in every person in the room, and that confidence was based on demonstrated excellence under pressure. Vera looked around at faces that had become familiar over 3 intensive weeks. Rodriguez, who had believed in her methodology when others dismissed it. Bennett, whose technical expertise and steady presence made everything easier. Oaks and Voss, who had shared years of hard-won knowledge freely. Webb, who led with quiet confidence that inspired rather than commanded. This was her team, her unit, her place in the world. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught, and the example he had set. He had believed that excellence was achievable through preparation, that impossible was just another problem waiting to be solved, and that the highest calling was service to something larger than self. She had spent her life living those principles, and they had brought her here, to a room full of people who shared those values, about to deploy on a mission that would push all of them to their limits. Rodriguez caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of partnership and trust. They were ready. The mathematics were sound, the preparation was complete, and the team was capable. What happened next would prove that the Scorpion shot was not a singular achievement, but the beginning of something larger. A new understanding of what precision shooters could accomplish, and a demonstration that limits were often just starting points for those willing to push beyond them. Tomorrow they would deploy into mountains that hid enemies who believed themselves safe from reach. They would establish positions that conventional wisdom said were too far, too exposed, too difficult. And then Vera would do what she had proven she could do. She would solve the equation that connected preparation to execution, mathematics to reality, impossible to accomplished. Because that was what she had spent 10,000 hours learning to do, and that was what her team needed her to do. The rest was just details, variables to be measured and accounted for, challenges to be overcome through skill and determination. She had done it before. She would do it again. That was the promise she had made to herself, to her father's memory, and to the mission that waited in the mountains.